We're a little after 4:30, so I'd like to get started. My name's Daniel Botsman. I teach here at Yale in the History Department, and on behalf of Professor Jing Su, who's the chair of the Council on East Asian Studies, but unfortunately away right now doing research in Hong Kong, I want to welcome you all to the 21st Annual John W. Hall Lecture in Japanese Studies. The Hall Lecture was established with the generous support of Mrs. Robin Hall in memory of her husband of some 55 years, John Whitney Hall, who was, as I'm sure you all know, a towering figure in the development of Japanese studies in the United States and, of course, here at Yale after World War II. I have various notes here about Professor Hall's many accomplishments, but I have been given permission to refer you all to the back page of the handout, which will give you more information about Professor Hall and his career. So as I have already said, this is the 21st year that a distinguished figure in the field of Japanese studies in the United States has been invited to deliver the John W. Hall Lecture. It is, however, the first time that the invitation has gone to one of our own Yale colleagues. And this, I think, is an indication of the very deep combination of esteem, respect, and gratitude that we all feel towards Professor Bill Kelly. Like John W. Hall, Professor Kelly completed his undergraduate degree at Amherst College before taking his PhD in sociocultural anthropology at Brandeis. He joined the Yale faculty in 1980, just a few years before Professor Hall retired, and in the decades since then, I think it's safe to say that no one has done more to ensure both the institutional and, more importantly, the intellectual vitality of Japanese studies at Yale than Bill Kelly. You're not here to listen to me today, and in the little bit of time I have, I don't think I can possibly do justice to the full range of Bill's contributions to the field of Japanese studies as a teacher, as an administrator, and of course, as a scholar. But let me just say that he is someone whose work has continually helped to define new research agendas and possibilities for the study of Japan. This is true of his foundational work on irrigation leagues and water control, his deeply nuanced study of popular protest across the 19th century, his articles on class formation and contemporary society, his brilliant new book on professional baseball and the Hanshin Tigers, and his now 2 decades of accumulated work on various aspects of sport and body culture in East Asia. So particularly in 2020, the year in which Tokyo will host its second Olympic Games, who could be better qualified to deliver the annual Hall Lecture than Professor Bill Kelly?
Well, thank you so very much, Danny. It was actually a very touching occasion for me. Jack Hall was one of my intellectual heroes, and as Danny intimated, my first years at Yale in the 1980s overlapped with his final years in his career here at Yale. And he was an enormously stimulating, demanding, supportive mentor to me and many others. And so to be able to speak in the Hall Lecture means a lot at the end of my own career at Yale with the Council and the Anthropology Department, my 2 homes here, and the colleagues and the students that have generously given of their time to come out today. Now, Jack Hall did not much care for sports. He did mountain climbing in the White Mountains and the rest of New England, but organized sports, as far as I know, didn't really interest him. So I have to have a kind of holographic figure of Jack Hall in a corner here to speak to somebody who doesn't care about sports about and around this event that will be opening 7 months today, counting the international dateline, in July 24th in Tokyo in 2020. And I want to, Jack Hall style, Japanese style, of giving you a brief resume. I want to talk about the Tokyo 2020 Olympics basically in 2 frameworks. One, in the framework of the Olympics themselves and the Olympic movement and the ways in which the very distinctive qualities of the Olympics helped to shape what is taking place now, has been taking place for several years, and will open formally in the opening ceremonies on July 24th. And because there is so much effort by those who are planning and promoting and producing the 2020 Tokyo Olympics to tie those Olympics to the previous Summer Olympics in Tokyo back in 1964. Sort of the second frame of reference I think that's important in understanding this year is the Tokyo 1964 Olympics and what they meant at the time and what people are trying to make them meet now. Mega event, term scholars like to use, when they're referring to sports, the two global mega events are the Summer Olympics and the Soccer World Cup, at least the Men's World Cup. Both of them share two qualities. They happen every 4 years, and both of them are run by gigantic organizations with enormous ideological pretensions, with very little transparency and not a fair bit of corruption. Otherwise, the FIFA World Cup and the Summer Olympics are very different beasts themselves. The FIFA World Cup is about a single sport, the world's most popular sport, soccer, in which some 36 teams will assemble. It's hosted by a country over 3 weeks. Some 850 soccer players are going to be playing a single game, meeting in a final. The Olympics, the Summer Olympics, are the largest multi-sport gathering in the world. In Tokyo, as you can see, some 33 sports that are run over multiple events, featuring over 11,000 athletes. Just as many media will be gathering over those 2 weeks. The logistics for organizing something like that are gargantuan, Olympian, and contrast considerably with the World Cup. Unlike soccer, whose rules, whose teams, whose players are known to billions around the world, most of the sports, almost all of the sports at the Olympics are not followed, are not even well known by most of us. The second quality of organizing something like the Summer Olympics is how do you educate, how do you draw in the audiences to justify, for example, the $4 billion that NBC has paid in order to broadcast the most recent Olympics. It's an enormous challenge to generate interest, let alone passion, in things like Madison cycling. What is Madison cycling? Or archery, or a water polo, or four-man kayaking. I mean, think about the world's largest global mega event is based on 33 sports that most people know very little about, care very little about, and only encounter once every 4 years. So there are remarkable qualities to the Olympics that distinguish it certainly from FIFA and most other events. Now, what I want to do today is not to explain Madison cycling or four-man kayaking or any of the sports, but to try to look beyond the sports themselves to what this thing is. That's not just the Olympics, but the Olympic movement. That's what it identifies itself as, capital O, capital M, and the particular forms that that Olympic movement will take in Tokyo in 7 months. If we follow the Olympic logic of 5, there are at least 5 distinctive qualities of the Olympic movement that are important in unpacking the nature of the games and that which comes before and after. There are lots of people in this building who study global formations, global structures, global organizations. It always surprises me that very few focus on the IOC. It's one of the earliest, one of the largest, one of the most consequential transnational sovereign organizations in the world. It yields enormous sort of analytical insight into the nature of global governance. Its origins, as some of you know, were not particularly propitious. It was a single individual, this rather obscure French aristocrat and educator in the 1890s who had the idea, stimulated by various factors, to organize an Olympics, gathered a few like-minded souls, and formed a committee, the International Olympic Committee, that put on the initial modern Olympics in Athens in 1896. The Pan-Athenaic Stadium, some of you may have visited, you can still see. Some of the events were less well organized. The swimming was held in the polluted harbor port of Piraeus amid the ferries going to and from the various Greek islands. But from this somewhat inauspicious beginning sprang over 125 years one of the largest global transnational organizations in the world. The details are too fuzzy. It's not the details, it's the color. It's the sense of the center of the IOC is up here with the president and the 4 vice presidents. As you can see, like a Yale secret society, it's entirely self-selecting, self-perpetuating, and not particularly transparent in its top governance. From that governance spreads some 30 different commissions about ethics and finance and other things directly controlled by the IOC Secretariat. It has its own bureaucracy. It has its own court to adjudicate issues involving licensing and athletic performance. This is a textual transposition of that graph, and you can see the extent that the IOC, or the tentacles that the IOC has spread across the globe through the performance of these sports, down to the direct contracts that it makes with each of the host cities that involve often the host city giving up legislative and sovereign rights for the duration of the Olympics. It's a kind of state of exception that's created every 4 years. It's not just an organizational behemoth, but it is a global marketing brand, probably the most valuable global sports brand in the world. The IOC itself has created a top tier of some 13 exclusive sponsors, initially from Euro-American corporations, now increasingly East Asia-based multinationals, from which it gains its revenue. Local host cities have a whole series of temporary sponsors in order to generate their own revenue. But it's not even that kind of commercial licensing and sponsorship, but rather broadcasting. That is the source of 3/4 of the IOC revenue, as you can see from roughly 68, Los Angeles particularly, the volume of revenue that is gained through broadcasting rights around the world really supports the IOC. It now has its own broadcasting service, so it's replaced commercial broadcasters in feeding the Olympic Games and everything else to its licensees. Given all of that, the other side of the Olympic movement seems to be a glaring hypocritical contradiction. All sports, or many sports, make claims for building character or displaying character or teaching life lessons, but there's no tennisism, and there's no hockeyism, and there's no baseballism, but there is Olympism. For 100 years, 125 years, there has been an effort by the IOC and Olympic leaders to articulate a full-blown philosophy about the power of sport through the filter of the Olympics in order to create the conditions of peace and harmony and teamwork and building. And it's done through the speeches, it's done through textbooks, it's done through events that it does continually year after year. More importantly, this kind of Olympism as philosophy has come to be expressed through the familiar pageantry that anyone turning on the television during the games themselves will encounter, from the opening ceremonies to the closing ceremonies. It was de Coubertin himself who invented the iconic 5-ring Olympic symbol. Lots of theories. One is that these are the 5 continents, each distinct but interlocked through the power of Olympism to have this common human experience. He also created a motto. The Olympic flame appeared in the 1920s. Hitler wanted to have the flame brought from Mount Olympus up through the Balkans to Berlin. And so he created the torch and the torch relay, which became essential in the lead up to the games themselves. The ceremonies, the emblems, the flag, the anthem, the oath, the creed, and now every host city for every games will create an entire panoply of medals and mascots, pictograms for the events. These are the medals for Tokyo 2020, which are very proudly done with recycled materials to express this Olympist philosophy now of sustainability. So that there is this Olympism in addition to the Olympic brand. I'll come back to that later. It's more than just a contradiction. It's a kind of a mutual construction of various implications of the Olympics. There's also Olympic gender. As you can see, there were no women in the earliest Olympics. De Coubertin and his time did not feel that that women were appropriate in public athletic display. Women started to appear in the 1920s, in the 1930s. It was really around the time of the Tokyo 64 Olympics that they were given more and more exposure, more and more resources, more and more equal billing. In Tokyo 2020, it's expected that the percentage will be around 50%. Why is that meaningful? Well, in the United States, since the 1970s, we've had Title IX. Title IX brought girls and women into sports. It had an enormous impact on the American sportscape. The rest of the world had the Olympics. I mean, it was the Olympics that, through the opportunity to perform and the incentives on countries to develop programs for female athletes that they might bring medals home for their country, that really did more than anything else to increase the level of female participation in athletics, particularly in elite athletics. So it's been enormously important as a force for bringing women's sports into some kind of recognition, parity in the Olympics, if not elsewhere. It also created the question of who is male and who is female, or at least who is an Olympic male and who is an Olympic female. I'll come back to that later, but as some of you know, the controversies in having created this not only multi-sport, but male-female venue creates the demands and the controversies over making that kind of distinction and defending some kind of sexual binary. Fourth quality is the IOC has not only come to embrace female athletics, it's come to embrace what is now called Paralympics, abled athletes and disabled athletes. It was around the time of the Tokyo 64 Olympics, I'll come back to that also later, in which the so-called handicap games were re-identified as the Paralympics and put on in the same venue immediately following the Olympics. It's the only major multi-sport event in the world that has beginning to pair so-called abled athletic performances and disabled athletic performances, calling into question what that sort of distinction is as well. In fact, at the Tokyo Paralympics that immediately followed the Tokyo Olympics, there are even more events, although fewer sports and half the athletes than there are in the Olympics because of the different categories that the Paralympic Committee has created to try to ensure different kinds of competition in these sports. And finally, sort of a fifth very distinctive quality of the Olympics that set it apart from most other sports events and organizations is what you call Olympic time. Olympic temporalities. We turn on the TV set next July 24th and we might watch the Olympics for 2 weeks. And then 4 years later, we'll do the same thing. But the Tokyo Olympics began in about 2004. Tokyo Olympics have been going on for over 15 years. When Ishihara, the nationalist governor of Tokyo, had in mind that Tokyo should host the 2016 Olympics, he started mobilizing, lobbying, generating resources and support in Tokyo to do that. It took a long time. Tokyo was one of the cities bidding for 2016. It lost out, but it immediately turned around and started mobilizing for 2020. It takes a long time to generate the local support in order to make a bid. It takes a long time to put that bid forward to the IOC and then be selected. The selection for Tokyo was in 2013, so there have been 6 years in which the Tokyo 2020 Olympics have been going on in order to reach that point 7 months from now. The games themselves are over in the blink of an eye. The legacy continues. The Tokyo 1964 Olympics are still going on. In the minds and mills of many other people. The other quality of Olympic temporality is that each of these Olympics has the same kind of cycle, and that these cycles overlap each other in very complicated ways, driving one another, influencing one another. Tokyo 2020, to a certain extent, is looking forward to the Beijing Winter Olympics in 2022, certainly to Paris in 2024, comparatively, is looking backwards to Rio most recently, to London, to Beijing certainly, and back to Tokyo 64. So the 125 years of the Olympics has created this very complicated sense of overlays of history and temporalities that are important for each and every of these single Olympics. So all of these is the qualities of the Olympics feed into, help to shape the ways in which the Tokyo 2020 Olympics are being put together. The other frame that I mentioned at the outset was this effort to hearken back to the experience and the effects of the Olympics in 1964, and reviving the spirit of the 64 Olympics is a phrase that's been used over and over by those who would promote and produce the Olympics this year. So let me turn to 64 and then come forward to 2020, where in 64, the phrase that was used most always to sum up the image that it was trying to project and the legacy that it hoped to leave in the aftermath of the Olympics was a sense of Japan, now almost 20 years at the end of the Pacific War, World War II, being recognized once again by the international order, and particularly the West, the Euro-American West, as a normal nation. And the Tokyo Olympics were aimed to demonstrate that once again it was in a position as a prosperous and peaceful nation to join the table of other nations. Well, again, the Olympic logic of five. If there were 5 images most indelible in the experience of the Tokyo 64 Olympics, it would be these. And let me talk about each one in order. This was, that tableau at every opening ceremony when the last of the relay runners enter the stadium, circle the stadium, and then go up the steps to light the Olympic torch. Of course, the final sacred runner was this 19-year-old boy who had been born on the edge of Hiroshima on the day the bomb was dropped, and this was an iconic moment, a meaningful moment for the Japanese. It was a victim of the atomic bomb. The IOC, to that point, had demanded that the head of state open each of the games in all of the host cities. Japan had no head of state. and the Ministry of Education very craftily persuaded the IOC to suspend its ruling and allow the emperor, who was not head of state but a symbol of the people, to appear opening the games as patron of the games rather than head of state. Japan had no military, it had self-defense forces, but the acrobatic skywriting team of the Air Force self-defense forces did the five rings over the stadium in the midst of the ceremony. All sorts of ways in which nationalists, the Kimi ga yo anthem was sung, the Japanese flag was raised. That opening ceremony itself was this moment in which there was a kind of sanitization of the important symbols of Japanese nationalism that had been suppressed for years before. Foreign media were brought in and given very carefully cultivated opportunities, photo opportunities, and sometimes interview opportunities with the imperial family. And Emperor Hirohito was, in a sense, repackaged through middle-class domesticity as a very different emperor than the Euro-American nations who arrived in Tokyo had experienced up to that point. And this is the figure with Hirohito and Akihito and Naruhito, the next three emperors, the current emperor who will preside over the 2020 Olympics, looking through this family photograph album in this quite odd photograph of the imperial family. The second thing that happened, and this image of the bullet train that we all use when we went to Japan, the first bullet train, the Shinkansen, was completed, made its journey from Tokyo Station to Shin Osaka on October 1st. And it represented the ways in which the Olympics set in motion allowed this massive transformation of the infrastructure, particularly of central Tokyo, but metropolitan Tokyo more generally. The Shinkansen, the intercity railroads, but also over 100 kilometers of highways in metropolitan Tokyo, often done as the elevated expressways that we still use throughout Tokyo, done in a deliberate engineering strategy to rise over the existing streets. Also, it allowed them to avoid having to buy land for the highways themselves. Haneda Airport was made an international airport. International hotels, government agency. Tokyo became a vertical city in 1964, where it had been much more of a horizontal city to that point. As you can see, one WAG in 1964 talked about this transformation as one between Kusai Toshi. Kusai is smelly, Toshi is city, from a smelly city to Kokusai Toshi, an international city. These are residents of Tokyo taking what was then a ferry up and down the Sumida River. And I don't know that there was anybody here who was in Tokyo in 1964. I wasn't, but it was by all reports a very unpleasant experience, highly polluted. And so, again, it was not just infrastructure construction, but it was redoing the sanitation and much else of Tokyo. It had this infrastructure transformation, a number of unintended consequences. Originally, the Olympics were planned with venues on the western edge of Tokyo because the American occupation forces and then the American military still controlled large areas in central Tokyo that they in turn had taken from the Imperial Army and the Imperial military. I mean, Tokyo was very much a military city. Throughout the 20th century, with parade grounds and barracks and military buildings all over the central city. In the negotiations with the Americans over getting some land to build some of the stadiums and some of the facilities, the Japanese initially planned to take the bases that were on the edge of the city. By surprise, in 1961, the Americans decided to turn over most of the central land that it was occupying, including most famously the so-called, what it had renamed, the Washington Heights complex that was used for military housing and schools and other sort of operations, which became the athletes' village, the gymnasium, the NHK Center, still standing today. So there was central Tokyo became a city of athletic facilities rather than a city of military parade grounds. Another of the unintended consequences, the point of the Shinkansen to its planners, or at least to its promoters, was that it would enable people in Tokyo to easily reach Osaka, and then as it was extended to other cities. In fact, the effect was the opposite. The Shinkansen enabled people from Osaka to get to Tokyo. Once they got to Tokyo, they stayed in Tokyo. As the Shinkansen and other intercity transportation developments in the 1960s created the latest and still continuing movement of much of the regional population and cities into Tokyo. The Onobori-san coming from the countryside, but also corporations that moved from Osaka into Tokyo. So among the transformations, not all of the effects were those intended by those who actually built them. A third was the use of architecture and the design of the facilities of the Olympics themselves to make a statement about, or to lead Japan into what was then the dominant architectural style of Euro-America, kind of international style of modernism, but with Japanese inflections of materials and design and reference. Tange, as some of you know, was influenced by the Yale hockey rink that had been right up the street, that had been opened in 1958. That and a couple of other buildings inspired probably the most famous of the Olympic buildings of the time. This is the interior. Another was the martial arts hall that Yamada designed, was built, again, to try to express this conjoining of an international style and traditional Japanese inflections. It was not just architecture, but aesthetics. It was the first time that the games were done in a European language speaking. The visitors couldn't understand Japanese signs, so the Japanese organizers developed pictographs of all of the different events, and from that point forward, every Olympics has competed to design ever more distinctive and pleasing pictograms for its events, along with posters. There were posters before, but the graphic designers that were mobilized by the Japanese created new standards of poster art for the Olympics. The Ichikawa Kong documentary that appeared shortly after the Olympics that was referencing Leni Riefenstahl's equally notorious and famous documentary of the Berlin examples was another example. Finally, Tokyo was cleaned up in other ways as well. The Yakuza bosses were persuaded to open training camps for all of their members outside of town so that they could clean the city of the Yakuza for the period of the Olympics. Buckets of yellow flags were put at all the intersections to help the tourists navigate the Tokyo traffic, and those buckets still remain in Tokyo. Taxi drivers were instructed in various forms of etiquette. He's not wearing white gloves, but white gloves began to appear. Honking was outlawed. In all sorts of ways, the effort was to use the material and hospitality infrastructures of Tokyo in order to present, to reimagine Japan. A fourth image is this photograph of the gold medal contest of the game between the Japanese national team and the Soviet Union. It can be read, and was read in sort of Cold War political terms, Japan as the ally of the US against the Soviet Union. The Japanese were actually already world champions. They had won the championship in Moscow in 1962. The Moscow press was quite quite taken by the Japanese team. They called them the Typhoon of the East. The Japanese media thought typhoons come and go, and these are forever, so they were called the Witches of the East, and that was the moniker that remained with this Japanese team through this gold medal. The media had been following this particular team, the women's volleyball team, for about 6 years in its training. It was largely, except for 2 members, the corporate team of Kanebo Corporation, which was a major textile, now a cosmetic corporation. The meanings of this photo and this team actually had less to do with international geopolitics and more to do with, this was the decade in which companies like Kanebo, in fact most manufacturing companies, depended heavily on recruiting graduates from junior high schools, often as groups from particular schools who were brought to the dormitories of the leading manufacturing companies. And this team was a demonstration to Japan, particularly to the Japanese parents and to the graduates themselves, of the attractiveness of these companies and life in these companies. It was the discipline, but it was also the sort of the recreation and the acclaim that they were able to gain from this gold medal. It had an enormous sort of demonstration effect on this pattern of employment. It also, because this was 80% of the Japanese tuned into this game. The televised views of Tokyo was an enormous attraction for the youth of Japan in the 1960s in drawing them particularly to Tokyo, but also to other cities as well. This particular team, together with the Yomiuri Giants, brought a whole genre of manga that continues today on sports konjo. So it had an enormous effect domestically. Finally, the Paralympics at that time were something of an afterthought, but their significance can't be overlooked. What was disabled at the time, particularly in Japan, but also in Europe, were those who had been injured in the war. The soldiers still in Tokyo lined the streets without adequate social services from the government seeking alms, and the sense of disability was still connected quite heavily to the veterans of the war. The Paralympics went a long way to reimagining a sense of disability as a much broader set of conditions. And in fact, the imperial household, and particularly Akihito, took an interest in using the Paralympics as a way of trying to generate some kind of social support, some kind of new policies for the disabled in Japan. So in lots, as I say, in those ways, it was not so much that Japan was demonstrating itself as a normal nation, but it was really that collectively creating a new historical baseline of that society for post-war Japan, disguising, replacing a sense of Japan as for its military imperialism, for the devastation after the war, replacing that with a very new view of Tokyo, and through Tokyo with Japan itself as the legacy of '64. Given that, you can imagine sort of the attractiveness of that legacy, or a selective legacy of '64 Olympics for those who were, again, planning and promoting the 2020 Olympics. Part of it is personal. That is, many of the senior figures in Japan at the moment, Abe himself is a bit too young, but we're teenagers in the 1960s. The 1964 Olympics, watching the Olympics, watching Japan watch the Olympics, had a powerful impact on their sense of their country. And so this effort now in 2020 to recreate from their gauzy childhood nostalgia a sense of what the Tokyo '64 Olympics works very powerfully. In fact, that's probably not what's going on in the general population beyond that particular cohort. Rather, I think there are at least 3 other sort of agendas that are particularly at work prominently in the run-up to the 2020 Olympics on the regional, which is to say the East Asia regional level, on the national level, and on the local Tokyo level. First of all, in 1964, Japan was looking to the West, looking to Europe and to America to impress, to be drawn into that particular international order. Geopolitically, the 2020 Olympics are much more about East Asia than Euro-America. And you can see the East Asian countries have become one of the central forces in the Olympic movement from the late 20th century into the 21st century. I mean, in fact, they've saved the Olympic movement with their hosting, with their participation, with their commercial sponsorship, with their TV audiences. But they are also competing with one another for the prestige of hosting, using all of the elements of the Olympics. Soft power has always been to me a somewhat mushy concept, but if it is ever to find a referent, it is the Olympics and the use that East Asian nations have made of hosting, vying to host and produce these Olympics. And you can imagine, I mean, the tensions that are rising in East Asia are stronger now than they have been for decades. Whether it's North Korea, South Korea, Japan, China, Japan, the repressions in Hong Kong and Taiwan and the Uyghurs. I mean, all of these tensions find expression in efforts to project the Olympics or to retard the Olympics. South Koreans, for example, as some of you know, have raised enormous protests over the potential use of the old Japanese flag. It was the flag of the imperial military forces. It's also the flag of lots of other things that are much less innocuous at the moment, but the South Koreans are demanding this flag not appear in the games or among spectators. There was the incident in London, again, a South Korean athlete who brought out this banner to suggest that the islands were Korean and not Japanese. So the potential to use the heavy sort of pageantry, ceremonialism, symbolism of the games in order to pursue these political frictions has been the South Koreans suggest that they're going to bring all of their food and all of their chefs because they can't trust Japanese foods after Fukushima. The Japanese, of course, are obviously quite irritated, protesting. I mean, all of these seemingly, if not trivial, at least somewhat symbolic fights have direct references and direct effects on the ongoing political frictions and economic struggles among these East Asian countries. So the 2020 Olympics are much more set within the current geopolitics of East Asia than something wider than that. Second thing that is sort of an important theme driving the ways in which the 2020 Olympics are defended and attacked are national, that is to Japan. The decade that has just ended last month doesn't have a name, but certainly it was bookended by the triple disasters that began on 2011, and will end the opening ceremonies of 2020. The disasters in Tohoku, the tsunami, the earthquake, and Fukushima that began this decade, and the demands of creating the Olympics in 2020. The obvious criticisms that have been played out for years now are the ways in which the Olympics are unnecessary, have diverted the resources that were essential to rebuilding Tohoku and resolving some of the Fukushima problems. And the promoters of the 2020 Olympics have responded by trying to repackage them as the recovery, reconstruction games. Again, suggesting with allusions to Tokyo and the '64 Olympics as a way of rebuilding the recovery of Tokyo from the ravages of that war. Another way of putting it is this is a decade that moved from disaster capitalism to celebration capitalism. Tohoku may suffer from the budget that has been diverted for Tokyo, but many of the major corporations that invested heavily, that have gained heavily from the recovery efforts in Tohoku, are the same ones that are profiting from the buildup in Tokyo itself. Naomi Klein, some of you know, has this wonderful characterization of the state of exception that is created by these large-scale disasters that suspend many of the normal rules of operating and allow capitalists and other developers to come in and to take advantage of these recovery efforts. Well, Jonathan Boykoff has an obverse of that, which is a kind of celebration capitalism, the ways in which particularly the Olympics, to a certain extent, the World Cup, open up opportunities for investment under special conditions that yield extraordinary profits. And perhaps the strongest example in Tokyo 2020 is the construction of what is initially the Athletes' Village, but will also then become, through a consortium of real estate and construction companies, one of the largest apartment complexes in Tokyo Bay. The irony is that as the IOC itself has come to emphasize sustainability and circumscribed investment in these Olympics, the consequence is that it focuses the investment on a smaller and smaller area. That is, almost all of the money that is going into the Tokyo Olympics is going into central Tokyo, which is only going to exacerbate the trend that began in 1964 with the now hyper-concentration of population and resources. I mean, Tokyo, Japan, is the country in the world with the largest, as you can see, the largest concentration of its populations in the capital metropolitan region. And the 2020 Olympics will only further intensify this movement of population and institutions into the Tokyo area. It seems odd that the final agenda that is driving the Tokyo bid, and it is an anxiety about its status as a global city. Now, this may seem odd to some of you. I mean, we have the U.S. News and World Report, and all these American colleges and universities get more and more nervous over the years about their exact standing in the rankings of these colleges. Well, global cities have their own metrics, their own rankings that actually seem to have more purchase on metropolitan officials, politicians, and corporations and institutions than we might imagine. And for some years, Tokyo has actually been fairly stable. This was a foreign policy magazine, started this in the 1990s. Got Saskia Sassen and other scholars to help them design a global cities index of various dimensions, and every year or every several years it's revised. And this has become apparently enormously important in Tokyo metropolitan circles in thinking about Tokyo's position vis-a-vis the other cities of the world, particularly its political, its economic dominance may be secure, but the cultural amenities and the social policies always seem to be somewhat fragile. It's not so much looking up as looking down. It may not think that it's going to overtake Paris or London or New York, but it's increasingly looking at Hong Kong and Singapore and Beijing and other East Asian capitals as it tries to secure its ranking. And the Olympics become a way in which not just physical infrastructure, but other kinds of adjustments to the quality of life in Tokyo can be pushed. In things as simple as signage that some of you have known if you've gone to Japan over the years, The Accommodations Act, which now requires certain kinds of barrier-free hotel rooms and other sorts of physical public facilities, auditoriums, this fleet of Toyota taxis that were rolled out to great fanfare last year with a barrier-free access. The current Metropolitan Governor Koike is particularly determined to reform the power pole pollution in Tokyo. As you can see, as anyone who's been to Tokyo knows, navigating the warren of power poles is one of the distinctive features of that city. So the Olympics become, in a sense, a way of packaging many of these issues that are difficult to pursue individually and respond to the anxiety that Tokyo feels as a global city. So it's both on the regional, on the national, on the metropolitan level, in which these sorts of agendas have been identified in our pursuit. Now, I haven't said anything about the actual controversies themselves, the particular issues that have arisen. Massive budget overruns, it's more like deliberate lowballing of the budgets that are probably 3 or 4 times what was initially announced. The diversion of the funds, the IOC chair was forced to resign, the bribery, the corruption that is uncovered with every Olympic cycle. It turned out the initial winning Tokyo poster logo had been plagiarized off the internet from a Dutch designer. Prime Minister Abe decided that the Starkitect Zaha Hadid's design was unappealing. It sort of said to look like a bicycle helmet. It was overturned, and they turned to a prominent Japanese architect to replace that. Of course, as of last week, the possibilities of a coronavirus that will continue to spread through the summer, and even if there isn't a substantial outbreak in Japan, the effects. So there are all sorts of ways in which this Olympics, like every other Olympics, the 1896 Athens Olympics was plagued with controversy about the financing and the location, the behavior of the American fans. The Olympics seem to raise the question constantly, why is it worth it? Why does anybody want to do it? Is it really worth the cost, the social, the political, the economic, environmental costs? The IOC is used to this. The IOC can roll out appeals to Olympism with every criticism that is lobbed at them or at the host city. I think, though, there's another way of thinking about the possibilities and the problems of the Olympic movement and what, in this instance, the Tokyo 2020 is apt to bring. Olympism interacts with the Olympic brand in rather more complicated ways than sheer hypocrisy. Because the IOC has invested so much over so much time in the ceremony and the pageantry and the symbolism of Olympism as a philosophy, as a set of claims, it creates conditions of its own, in a sense, self-entrapment. It can be, and actually has been, forced to live up to the rhetoric of its philosophy. The new emphasis on sustainability, the new efforts to include trans athletes, the efforts to require host cities, particularly after the Sochi Winter Olympics, to demonstrate and to be accountable for diversity, not just in the athletes' population, but also in media access and in the treatment of visitors. All of these are ways in which people can use not the vices that critics uncover about the Olympics, but the virtues that the IOC itself claimed to represent through this sporting pageantry. Let me give you, 3 examples here at the end of this kind of rhetorical self-entrapment that is a way in which, in fact, the Olympics, they might not be worth it, but there are ways in which they can be leveraged for progressive movement. As I said, females have been brought in as athletes into the Olympic Games, especially from the 1960s on. But that has raised the question, forced the IOC to make determinations about exactly not who is a female, but who is an Olympic female. Who is a female for the purposes of dividing events into men's events and women's events. And if any of you have followed this, you know that from anatomical inspections, that was the standard in the 1960s, where female athletes under question would have to parade naked in front of a panel of doctors and officials to determine by sight if they were male or female. To more molecular or cellular and now endocrinological investigations into levels that would determine the line between male and female. Every ways in which this has been measured has been proven to be dubious and unsupportable. The Olympics have been probably the most public platform we have for undermining the surety of a sex binary. Now, the end result may not be the giving up a distinction between male sports and female sports and coming up with other ways of classifying athletes to create equal competitions, but one can imagine that, in fact, there will be continual challenges to this sense of a male-female divide as it has been used to preserve this style of athletics. A second sort of way in which the Olympics, by the sheer force of their scale, have undermined some of our sureties is in, again, there's human bodies and there are athletes' bodies. There are so many sports in the Olympics with all different kinds of instruments and technologies and human activities that this whole line between the human body and its artificial assemblages and instruments, if it doesn't disappear, it's continually disrupted by these efforts to rule. The horse does not receive a medal in the Olympics yet, but equestrian events, who is the athlete here? Is it the horse? Is it the rider? Or is it some cyborgian combination of the two? Yes, this is an archer who is pulling a bow and releasing an arrow, but if you're doing that hundreds of times a day, day after day, year after year, where does the body end and the instrument begin? What is the thing that is the archer if it does not include at least parts of the archery? Racing, somehow this is the medium between the human body and the water below, but the skull is as much a part. The entity is not the individual body. The entity is this racing skull and the humans and the oars and the skull itself that form that which is competing against other similar units. The sports have a way, the point is, sports have a way of raising questions about what we assume to be inviolable boundaries between that which is human, that which is artificial. Paula Radcliffe, once the world record holder as a marathoner. These are they accessories or do they make the marathoner? say sports, as I say, particularly the Olympics, particularly the particular qualities of the Olympics, encoding this in a philosophy, having multiple sports on display at the same time, raise these questions about the boundaries or the lack of boundaries of the human body. This is true particularly for paraplegic athletes. The notorious Oscar Pistorius, one of the first to raise these questions of, should he be running in the Olympics or the Paralympics? He certainly, in fact, at one point was allowed to run in both the Olympics and the Paralympics. Are these his legs, or are these prosthetics that attach to what's left of his legs? I mean, these raise really deep questions about the nature of the body. And it leads, thirdly, to another way in which the Olympics or the IOC's embrace of the Paralympic movement and bringing the Olympics and the Paralympics closer and closer together. At this point, they're still somewhat separated, but one can imagine, a time in the not too distant future when the games are conjoined into a single Olympics, and we begin to question these lines between the able body and the disabled body, because these are elite athletes performing, whether in a wheelchair or in their special Nike shoes. And to what extent this is a distinction that can be sustained, I think is seriously challenged by the ways in which the Olympics are constructed, the Olympics are performed. So these and other controversies reveal to me that sports, and especially the Olympics, have been one of the most influential public stages for dramatizing this modern conundrum, which is that for all of our efforts, strenuous and continuous, to construct and to codify and to police the distinctions of modern life, we're equally challenging and questioning and eroding those very distinctions. The Olympic movement, as I've tried to suggest, is unique in the world of global sports, and it's uniquely powerful for its distinctive qualities, especially its self-perpetuating political structure, its economic monopoly on the one hand, and its pious and public professions of Olympism as a balance of body and mind and spirit, as a balance of effort and execution and achievement on the other. It's a contest between the Olympic brand and the Olympist philosophy. And the temporal structure of the Olympics and the distributed geography of the hosting leads each Olympics to strive for this doubled quality of exemplifying the generic form of an Olympic Games, given the rigid IOC-imposed stipulations, and producing a uniquely memorable and consequential mega event that is fitting in and standing out simultaneously. And we can see these twin imperatives in their nascent form in the 1964 Tokyo Olympic Games, and in their mature form in the recent Olympics, including the 2020 Tokyo Games. It's tempting to characterize, it's tempting to discount the crass commercialism and the lofty idealism as a hypocritical and a disabling contradiction at the heart of the Olympic movement. But it's also possible, and I think more analytically productive, to see this as a dynamic and dramatic entanglement, that is, as a mutual conditioning that has demonstrated the potential for progressive as well as for regressive outcomes. The Olympics are fun to watch, but to me more valuable, they're good to think. And I hope that I've given you a few provocations this afternoon that will sustain you through the sometimes tedious hours of watching Madison cycling and four-man kayaking. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think there's time for any questions before we move up to the reception. Yeah, Peter.
Thank you, Bill, for that wonderful exploration of all the various meanings of a particular event that many of us don't care about very much, or somehow seduced into watching or used in part. Now with this event, at least from my perspective, are these sequences of expositions.
Mm-hmm.
It just so happens the Paris exposition of 1900 was also the second Olympic Games
Right.
of 1900.
Right.
And Japan appeared.
Mm-hmm.
Paris exposition.
It did.
So could you make a little bit of a comparison between these expos, East Asia, and the Olympics?
Well, it's a fascinating question. It's important because what's interesting to me is how expositions were very well developed by the 1900 Paris Exposition, going back to Crystal Palace in the 1850s and even before that. So in the 19th century, it was this world exposition or industrial fairs that was the template for this kind of gathering, to display the fruits of technology and culture, bringing, through the imperial circuits in most cases, but still the Chicago Exposition in the 1890s. The interesting thing is how expositions, they haven't died out, but they never gained the kind of organizational strength and sort of sustaining that the Olympic Games came. The Olympic Games were to the 20th century what expositions were to the 19th century. The expositions continue, as I say, but in fact, Osaka, having lost out its opportunity to bid for the Olympics in Japan, has turned around and bid for, and Shanghai did the same thing for its exposition. So the expositions have become sort of backups to the games, but they've lost their power as the venue for bringing the world's nations and peoples and economies together. And Paris was that moment. Because in fact the exposition was more important than the Olympics. And the Olympic Games were spread out through the months of the exposition. And there were some people who came to participate and they didn't even know they were participating in the Olympics. And there was an American athlete who months later got a medal in the mail and didn't know what it was because she had won a medal, but nobody had ever told her. So it was something of an afterthought. But very quickly, it became the dominant and the exposition the subordinate. Yeah, yeah.
I was thinking of games in general.
Yeah.
And the one group I can think of that needs games to do its job are the urban planners who have an idea of remaking the city.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter whether it's the Commonwealth Games, the World Cup, the Olympics, the Asian Games, and so on, because then you get to declare martial law, more or less,
Right.
and you get to remake the city and do all of the things that are probably gridlocked by local municipal politics
Right.
in normal times.
Right.
So if I were an urban planner, I would get games, any games at all, the bigger the better, because it's the opportunity that with once in a lifetime opportunity to remake large parts of the city.
Precisely. And that's why, of all the games, the Olympics are the most sought. I mean, for the World Cup, all you need is to refurbish your national stadium. And then you build a couple soccer stadiums around the country. But Tokyo's got 33 different sports. I mean, the venues and then the connections among the venues and the housing of 10,000 athletes rather than 800 soccer players. As I said, the scale of the Olympics speak to your point about it being, both a planner's dream and a planner's nightmare. But in any case, it's a cover for agendas that were long in play I mean, the bullet train had been planned really since the 30s, but in the 1950s. And it languished because of the scale of the budget required. Along comes the Olympics, and it became the highest priority. We have to finish that Shinkansen no matter what. So yes, planners, people may not, but planners love the Olympics. Yeah.
Thanks for running this talk. It showed up on a slide that you zoomed right past it, this issue of the Olympics is non-political
Right.
officially. And I think it was maybe last week that they announced that they weren't going to allow any political expression. And
Right.
I think at the same time as they announced that the Japanese imperial
Right.
war flag could be displayed by fans in the stands.
Right.
I was wondering if you had any comments on this notion of the depoliticization of what's very obviously a political space, either in general or if there is any specific context of Tokyo 2020,
Yeah.
whether, temporal, and we've seen these protests by like Hong Kong esports athletes. Recently, it's this Asian geopolitical context, in the context of the U.S., we've seen a lot of Black Lives
Right.
Matter related protests at football games, basketball
Right.
games, or in the context of Japanese domestic politics. If there's anything specific to the Tokyo 2020 that is creating this particular instantiation of the
Right.
the
Well, of course,
I mean, the three different agendas I was talking about are deeply political, every single one of them. And so, as you say, the rhetoric is fascinating. I mean, the insistence that the games are deep political is an intensely political statement. It's that, our politics count, the politics of the IOC, but the politics of the individual athletes don't. So, but this, and again, this 1896, these issues of the political significance of the order of the countries that were marching into the stadium was played out. So it's built into, and the more ceremony that is added to the Olympics, the more platforms you have for political expression. The torch relay in China before the Beijing Olympics in 2008 is a good example. Or the torch relay in 1964 that went through Southeast Asia and then Taiwan and then Okinawa before coming to the mainland was a transparently political move by the planners. So, I mean, that's why the IOC, with a straight face, can say things like that. I mean, Avery Brundage was a racist, anti-Semitic. I mean, to say something like that is so transparently false that it is almost beside the point of the politics of the Olympics that are built in, as I say, at every level. And in the upcoming 2020, those are some of the politics. The East Asia frictions, this national debate about where resources should be directed, and how Tokyo has to reposition itself to maintain its global standing. And disability, I mean, the NGOs and the NPOs are very effectively using politics in order to push the Olympics to invest in making Tokyo more accessible and more barrier-free. I mean, that's a very productive political struggle that's been going on for a number of years. Yeah.
Well, having just come from a burning continent, I've been thinking a lot about the fact that this is happening in the summer. And I noticed that you had put in one of the slides that 64 was held in October. And my understanding is that 2020, the American broadcasters insisted that it happened in the middle of July.
That's probably, I mean, again, the IOC is not transparent enough to know for sure, but it was probably NBC, the major licensee, that insisted that they needed the August audience as opposed to the fall audience. Up to actually Rome 1960, they were also worried about the summer heat in Rome, and they moved that to the fall. And so Tokyo originally was supposed to do it in July, but petitioned to have it in October, actually October 10th, the Summer Olympics. But by 2020, the broadcasting revenues are so important that they're going to force the athletes, these 11,000 athletes, to perform in the heat and humidity of Tokyo in late July. And of course, you saw the picture, photographs, those of you who go to Japan, of the preliminary events and the tournaments they had last summer were appalling. Even they shortened the races. They have moved the marathon, which is from 1896, was the iconic event of the Olympics, always held on the last day. The Tokyo Marathon, of course, sponsored by the Metropolitan Subway System because the route runs along the major subway routes. It's a way of advertising the Tokyo Metropolitan Subway. And so when the IOC forced the Japanese organizing committee to move the marathon from Tokyo up to Sapporo, this was a major shock. Abe and Koike and everybody lobbied the IOC to keep the marathon. They would run it at 2 o'clock in the morning. They would do anything to keep it in Tokyo. But the marathon is one of the few events that has been, for those reasons, moved to Sapporo. But if anyone was in Sapporo last summer, it was brutal. It was over 100 for days and days. So I'm not sure that moving it to Sapporo is necessarily going to solve their problem.
Thank you. Are there reliable opinion polls of Tokyo's inhabitants regarding hosting the Olympics?
I'm sorry,
What feedback do we have?
Well, like many polls about controversial issues, both sides have generated, because again, the IOC, part of its stipulations for bidding is to demonstrate not just official interest, but public support, local public support. And so these bid packages that, well, this year they reduced the price, but it cost $650,000 US to bid for the Olympics. And it included demands that extensive public polling be to demonstrate local support. But the opposition in Vancouver and Tokyo have also come up with polls to demonstrate the opposite. So it's difficult to judge the validity of these competing polls that seek to test and to use local opinion for both sides. And Tokyo was really split on that issue. Boston, of course, when it was proposed for Boston, that was actually through a referendum, but the polling there was used to generate significant opposition. Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I actually watch Olympics very religiously.
Yeah.
So I kind of know the answers to this question, but this is important for everyone to know. What are some of the events and things that we should keep an eye on while thinking about the critical questions that you raised in the talk?
It's a good question. And of course, if you are one of those people who are interested in the sports of the Olympics as well as everything else, you will know that there are as many Olympics as there are countries. And the distribution of broadcasting fees now allow every country to create its own Olympics. And so, the Olympics that is produced by CBC in Canada is very different than the Olympics produced by NBC or produced by Argentine state television. And so the events that one pays attention to are often shaped by what is decided by the national body. So there's a nationalization of this transnational experience that's quite interesting and changes from Olympics to Olympics. To me, these issues of the body and the ends of the body or the endless body, this biotechnical entity that are athletes is particularly fascinating in those kinds of sports. Sailing is another example. The issues of gender or sex determination and the indeterminacy of sex determination, certainly have been litigated most extensively in track and field. And issues of the abled and the disabled have also been litigated most publicly in issues of track and field. So in thinking about those issues, those are the kinds of sports that have had the most powerful, in a sense, demonstration effect for forcing us, to rethink, to destabilize these kinds of contrasts.
There's no further questions, and please join with me in thanking Professor Taylor.